totally different from each other, which do different things in different areas and are different in just about every point. They have almost nothing in common. And as a result, when people think that they're all instances of the same thing, they're confused already. People who think, for instance, that copyright law and patent law are similar are totally confused, can't possibly understand copyright law or patent law, because really they're almost completely different. And then trademark law is even more different. So if you think that copyright law and patent law and trademark law are three different instances of this three different species of the same genus, you'll never understand. And lawyers and people who want to intimidate you know how useful that term is for confusing people. It's no accident that Microsoft frequently brings up that term, that the movie companies and record companies love to use that term. And they're talking about various different things all the time, but you'd never guess that, because they make it sound like it's the same thing. And the point is, they don't want people to think clearly about copyright law or about patent law or about trademark law. To think clearly about them starts from keeping them separate. They're separate subjects with nothing to do with each other. And then you can learn about each one, and you can come to understand each of these laws which you're interested in, and think carefully about it. To think carefully about them, we have to avoid mixing them up. In general, if someone uses the term, quote, intellectual property, unquote, either he's confused or he's trying to confuse you. So in this talk, I'm talking about copyright law, which is a law restricting the use of a particular work of authorship. Specifically, restricting the details of the expression of that work, not the ideas. The ideas are not copyrightable. Anybody can write an algebra book, and it's not considered to be copying from another algebra book. It's not copyright infringement, because copyright doesn't cover ideas like that. It only covers the way the subject is expressed in one particular textbook. That's not true of patent law. Patent law is totally different. So, the question that people asked me can be expressed as, what should copyright say about other kinds of works? Now, in order to think about copyright law, it's useful to look at its history. And the history of copyright law is closely connected with the history of copying technology. And we need to think about copying technology in order to think about what copyright law should say. Now, changes in technology can't affect basic moral principles, which are too deep for technology to reach. But when we apply our principles to a specific question, we do it by looking at the consequences of the various choices we could make. And those consequences can be changed by the context. For instance, suppose we could resurrect the dead. Then killing somebody wouldn't be so bad. You just say, well, you killed him, you have to pay for his new body. Right? It wouldn't be a big deal. So let's look at the history of copying technology and the history of copyright law that is developed with it. Copying began in the ancient world, where it was done with a writing instrument. You would read one copy and you'd write another. That was the first technology for copying things. Now, this technology had certain consequences. First of all, it didn't require any special skill beyond the skill to read and write. Anyone who could read and write could copy more or less as efficiently as anyone else. Second, it didn't require any special equipment beyond that needed to read and write. Third, it had no economy of scale. To make 10 copies took 10 times as long as making 1 copy. So the result was that people just made copies one at a time wherever they wanted one. If you had 1 copy of a book and you wanted another, you'd copy it. As far as I can tell, there was no such thing as copyright in the ancient world. Anyone who had a book and wanted to copy it was free to do so, unless the king didn't like that book, and then maybe he'd execute you. However, there was a big advance in copying technology, the printing press. The printing press was a big advance because it made copying more efficient, but not uniformly so. Some kinds of copying became a lot more efficient and others were not affected. The reason is that the printing press has an inherent economy of scale. It takes a lot of work to set the type. But once you've done that, you can make many identical copies efficiently. Furthermore, the printing press and the type were expensive, specialized equipment that most readers didn't have and didn't know how to use. The result was a centralized system for copying. The copies of any particular book were made in a few places and then transported from there to the people who wanted to read them. For the first few centuries of printing, it was still quite common for people to copy books by hand. This was generally done either for rich people to show how rich they were, or by poor people. As the song goes, time ain't money if all you got is time. So, hand copying continued, but most of the copies were made by printing after that point. Copyright developed in the age of the printing press. The oldest copyright systems I know of, anything like copyright, started around 1500. In Italy, it became common that if you wrote a book, you could ask a prince to give you a monopoly on printing it. Princes like to give out monopolies over all sorts of things as rewards for some kind of support. So if you said in the front of the book that this prince was really wonderful, then he'd probably give you a monopoly over printing it. The current copyright system, I believe, came out of England, but the first